It's one of the world's most prominent religions. But it started as a mysterious cult that should never have survived. They were enemies of Rome, practicing a forbidden faith in secret, marked by persecution, martyrdom, and murder. Through new research, we unravel how Christianity conquered Rome, spread its message, and built its churches upon the ruins of a fallen empire. Rome is a vast empire. It stretches from the forests of northern Europe to the deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle East. So not surprisingly, around AD 30, the killing of an obscure rebel in Jerusalem, Jesus, goes almost unnoticed.
The execution of Jesus would have made not that much of an impression. It would be like a bandit being executed and then making perhaps page 35 in the corner of the New York Times.
Jesus' followers have yet to surface in Rome. They're practically unknown. This, after all, is a city of 1 million people. But their Christian religion is fundamentally at odds with everything Rome stands for. Confrontation will come, but when? Ancient Romans are polytheists. There's a god for every person, every trade, and every situation. A warrior going into battle pays homage to his patron, Mars. A tradesman seeks help from Mercury, the god of commerce. And Jupiter is the protector of all. His temple looms over the Roman Forum, where he watches over government, justice, law, and order. Romans believe that their gods walk among them, directly intervening in the daily life of the city.
The Romans believed that they were descended from the god Mars. Mars had consummated a physical relationship with a Vestal Virgin, and that relationship gave birth to Romulus and Remus. So the god Mars was the father of the first king of Rome.
In contrast, Christians believe in one all-powerful God. Their leaders preach peace, modesty, and a readiness for the afterlife. But the Romans draw little distinction between political and spiritual power.
And at the head of the whole system is the Roman emperor. He is the head of Roman religion. And it's all interconnected. The worship of the emperor, the worship of the gods. It was a place teeming with cults and temples and shrines. This is Rome.
It's the state's duty to honor and appease the gods, for the city to prosper. So in the heart of the Forum, in the temple of Vesta, a group of women are required to keep watch.
There's a symbolic fire always burning, tended by the priestesses, and it's very, very important to the Romans. Now, tradition has it that the fire goes all the way back to Rome's earliest beginnings, and the Romans feared that if it would ever go out, it would be a terrible omen for the future of the city.
A sacred trust has been placed in the Vestal Virgins. They are the most powerful women in the city.
There are 6 Vestal Virgins. They're chosen in childhood by the chief priest, the emperor. And they dedicate their lives for 30 years to the goddess Vesta. Their chastity and purity keep the goddess happy.
When the city prospers, they get credit. But when disaster strikes, a bad harvest, military defeat, or outbreak of plague, they are blamed for failing in their duties.
And they said, well, something's gone wrong, the gods are displeased with us, one of the Vestals is unchaste, and when she was accused of unchastity, she was buried alive.
It's a lesson that the Christians should learn. Religion and the Roman state are so closely bound together that a threat to one is seen as treason toward the other, and Rome will strike back. Evidence shows that when there's no perceived threat, Rome is open-minded, even liberal.
In my view, Roman religion was the most tolerant of any religion I can name. What we find, in fact, is that Romans were probably initially surprised by the rigid monotheism of the Christians. They just couldn't understand why they couldn't worship other gods.
The Romans have their official pantheon of deities. But as the empire grows and absorbs new cultures, it also welcomes new gods.
So, for example, it admitted a goddess from Egypt, Isis, who promised her worshippers salvation. It welcomed Mithras, who was a god perhaps from Persia.
Before the rise of Christianity, these cults attract thousands. There are more temples to Isis than to Jupiter. And Mithras is hailed widely among the military. They gather in halls, similar to churches that are soon to come. They share a ritual meal, as the Christians will. But they also make sacrifices, and they have their own powerful myth of creation.
At the center, in the apse of every Mithraic cult hall, was a relief, a sculpture, or a fresco depicting the original event, the tauroctony, when Mithras slays the bull. By slaying the bull and spilling its blood, Mithras lets loose a force that fed the universe.
Worshippers of Mithras and Isis also accept the Roman gods and are left alone. But the Christians will be persecuted. Yet Christianity is one of only a few cults that will grow into a worldwide religion. Roman authorities are slow to recognize the movement that is growing. Initially, Christians are only seen as a sect of the Jews.
As Christianity starts out, obviously, as a Jewish cult, a Jewish religion, Jesus was a Jew, and all of the early Christians considered themselves Jews.
The state is content to leave its Jewish citizens alone. While they account for 1 in 10 of the population, there are reasons why they aren't considered a threat. They don't seek converts. Being Jewish is as much about blood as it is about faith. And in a city that places great value on history, the Jewish religion predates the Romans.
What gave them respectability was that their religion was manifestly old. They were just considered a strange and different community that kept to themselves.
But the first Christian missionaries emerge with a message that's much more threatening.
Generally speaking, early Christianity is a religion of the poor and people who aren't part of the system.
Rising from the lowest segments of society, the Christians worship one of their own.
What was peculiar about Christianity, to a Roman's point of view, is that it originated recently with a particular individual, and that particular individual was executed as a criminal, made the religion even more peculiar and more suspicious to the Roman authorities.
But by the time it hits Rome, it's already an established presence in cities across the Eastern Empire.
Religions spread rather like diseases. They spread most easily in urban contexts, and the Eastern Mediterranean is extremely heavily populated with cities at this time.
The Christian message is spread via networks that the Romans built themselves. Their trade routes, their road system. Finally, missionaries spread the message to the imperial authorities. And one missionary walks thousands of miles on Roman roads. He is a prisoner, sent for trial by Jerusalem's Jewish elders who find his message offensive. His name is Paul, and he is revered in Rome long after the empire falls.
Paul was greeted by representatives from the Christians already in the great metropolis. Now Paul was coming to Rome itself. He had come to the center of the world empire, and the emperor would now decide his fate.
The Emperor Nero's actions could be seen as a very costly error. Paul is secluded at home for 2 years before his trial, but during that time, he's still able to preach. This church is said to be built near the site where he stayed.
This is about as close as we can get to where Paul the Apostle might have been when he came to Rome. We're in a commercial district, and we know from Paul's own letters that he himself was a tradesman. It seems to make sense that when Paul came to the city of Rome, to come along an alleyway like this, and would have met other tradesmen that would have shared a great deal with Paul. So we think this is where he was, and this is what he did.
It's in meetings held here that the entire foundation of the Roman Church is laid.
They'd have come together, they'd have been evangelizing, they'd have been talking, they'd have been growing the community. But within that community, they're meeting together for table fellowship, they're meeting to pray, they're meeting to sing hymns of praise, and forming these kinds of Christian networks that start to really grow and take hold in the city.
The Christian's message doesn't appeal to all. To the urban poor, it's simple and seductive.
Christians were promised that they were going to a happier place, a place that they would be welcomed, and they would be one of the elect in this place called heaven.
And yet to the ruling elite, the dedicated followers of the old religion, the gospel sounds like a challenge.
Jesus was quoted as saying, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword." If I were a Roman on the streets in the 1st or 2nd century AD, I really would have wondered about this new God. The righteous will be taken up into the kingdom of heaven, and the unrighteous, he says, will be cast into a furnace.
By pure coincidence, a fire is coming and will burn down over half of Rome. And the emperor will ensure that it's the Christians who pay. In AD 64, the worst fire in Rome's history wipes out 70% of the city's buildings. This is the moment when Romans turn on the Christians. As the smoke clears and the scale of the damage is revealed, the Emperor Nero is faced with 2 urgent tasks: to start rebuilding and to find someone to blame.
It was believed by many that Nero himself had set the fire in order to clear an area where he could then build his palace, the palace that he constructs very close to the Flavian Amphitheatre today, the Colosseum.
He sees an opportunity to simultaneously divert suspicion away from himself and deal with a growing threat.
Nero blamed the burning down of the city of Rome on the Christians.
He could then attack them, have them persecuted, have them burnt or crucified to the edification of other people in the city.
Nero orders execution for the Christians. And 2,000 years later, our image of the pagan Roman emperors is defined by his violence.
Now, he didn't just kill them. He made a sport of it. He had some of them wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. He had some of them crucified, and he even had some of them dipped in pitch and set alight. It was a truly terrifying time to be a Christian in Rome.
Romans equate justice with humiliation, maximum cruelty, and public degradation. It's the best way to take down a public enemy. Paul, the great missionary, dies during this time. And many others become Nero's victims as well. The precise death toll is unknown. This is a time in Christian history that quickly turns to mythology.
Nero's persecution was spectacular, but probably killed far fewer people than was believed within a century. It was claimed by early Christian writers that thousands died. Possibly fewer than 100 died at the time.
Persecution of Christians was brutal, and it was horrific, and no one should have had to suffer that way. But as far as we know, it was far more sporadic and far briefer than some of the rumors, let's put it that way.
With each telling, the story grows. For every Christian life Nero takes, he makes a recruiting agent for the new faith. The most powerful of these was Peter, the Apostle, the first bishop of Rome.
St. Peter is probably the greatest of the 12 apostles of Jesus. Plucked from obscurity from Galilee, where he was just a fisherman, he's given a change of name by Jesus. Jesus says, you're no longer going to be called Simon. I'm going to call you Peter, because you are the rock, Petros, on which I will build my church.
Today, this site remains a place of pilgrimage. The church that stands here is called St. Peter in Prison, because in the 1st century, there is a notorious jail here. Peter is in Rome during the aftermath of the Great Fire and is arrested by Nero.
St. Peter gets caught up, and just as Jesus had prophesied, he is taken a place that he does not wish to go. And legend, very ancient legend, says, this is the place he was brought. This is the prison in which he spent his last night. On the wall, you've got crosses carved. There's another one here. There's a very big one here. But for me, what's most powerful is this. Here is the cross upside down, and the tradition says this is how Peter was crucified. He said, I'm not worthy to be crucified as my Lord was crucified. I want to be crucified upside down.
Peter is killed. Few can know the effect that his death will have. In one sense, the purges backfire, because every time a martyr goes peacefully to his death, he demonstrates the power of his message.
Romans were not looking forward to death in the way that Christians may have been. One thing we have to remember about Christianity that absolutely separates it with a very wide margin from ancient Roman religion was that Christianity promises that its adherents will go to a good place when they die.
But still, Nero's attacks drive the Christians underground. They have to operate in secret, provoking rumor, suspicion, and confusion.
They saw baptism, they saw Christians lowering people, even children, into the water, and they believed that Christians were drowning people. This was part of their faith. It was their custom to call one another brother and sister if they were in the faith. If an average Roman heard a Christian addressing his wife as sister, an average Roman would think that they were engaged in incest. They heard that Christians ate the body and blood of a man, their god. So Romans hearing this on the street thought Christians are cannibals.
While stories of courage and martyrdom attract new followers to the faith, misunderstandings breed suspicion and hatred. Christianity does grow, but it must do so in secret. For almost the first 300 years of its history, Christianity is a forbidden religion. Its followers are mainly poor and disenfranchised. They suffer harassment and discrimination. Yet their numbers increase. Other cults fade and disappear, while this one endures because of its clear and practical advantages. The Christians have neither the wealth or security to compete with the Romans, who build grand temples and statues to their gods. and worship with elaborate public rituals. Instead, Christians keep things simple.
When Christ at the Last Supper, just before he's crucified, takes the bread and the wine, he took the most ordinary things that every household would have, and he said, whenever you share this with friends, or with a stranger, or with anybody, I am with you. And the communion service, here it would have been known as an agape, a Greek word meaning a love feast, was the ultimate Christian statement that Christ had not died, but had risen again, and was seated with them. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, he says, I am with you.
The early Christian followers have no right of public assembly and are not permitted to build churches. But they turn ordinary buildings into places of worship and in secret begin to build a new society. From the outset, women are key players. This is St. Cecilia's, a 19th century shrine to a 3rd century martyr, one of the most important figures in the early years of the church.
You can get underneath the church and see what was there before. The ruins of a 2nd century apartment building. What we think is that there are Christians who came here and that this was actually the house that belonged to Cecilia herself, and that she started what we call a house church in this space here.
In male-dominated Roman society, the home is the one place where women have control.
Out on the street, women weren't allowed to have positions of authority. They couldn't hold public office, for instance. But once you were inside a house, a woman could flourish. She could really come across as somebody who had a great deal of authority in her own space.
Cecilia's home becomes a safe house where groups can gather. And though there's little formal structure to the early church, it connects its members to other Christian cells across the empire.
They provide opportunities for these traveling missionaries who couldn't preach on the streets to come and do so in their living rooms. Women came in droves. And most of the converts that we know about were apparently women. And the messages would spread, women would be there and would be around listening to this, and then they would go to their homes and they would talk to their families about it, and they could raise their children according to the sort of virtues and messages that they had learned from these traveling missionaries.
Some scholars believe that the new faith attracts women for one specific reason.
Women got a raw deal from traditional Roman religion. Within the Roman world, within traditional Roman structures, young girls had a very small chance of surviving. If a family had a second daughter, that daughter would very likely be killed shortly after birth. Christian society didn't allow this. Women adopted Christianity because to them it was a way of preserving their family.
The message that all are equal in the sight of God means that Christianity is recruiting in areas that other cults ignore.
It admitted all comers, so it admitted slaves, it admitted free people, men, women, rich, poor. Anyone could join without an initiation fee, which other mystery cults actually charged. They charged initiation fees. You needed to pay no money to worship Jesus.
And to those with nothing, the Christian network offers real, practical help.
Poorer people were attracted because of the social institutions that church organizations provided. So that if you were poor and if you were ill, the church would take care of your children. If you needed a job, a member of your society might be able to find you a job. If you needed food, the Christians would provide you with food.
They set out to win hearts and minds. It works.
Christian communities encourage people to stay and nurse the sick, whether they be Christian or pagan. Now, what would be the natural response? They would be far more likely themselves to convert to Christianity.
In fact, the Christians' attention to healthcare is so successful that people simply live longer.
One finds waves of epidemic disease sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean, wiping out large numbers of the population, some estimates as high as 30%. Christians nursed more effectively than pagans. The Christian community had a much higher chance of survival.
They have a high rate of conversion, low infant mortality, increased life expectancy. The march of the Christians is unstoppable. It just takes time.
Within a fairly stable population of around 60 million, Christians would be an increasingly large percentage. 10 years or so after the death of Christ, there are 1,000 Christians. And by the year 250, there would be approximately 1.1 million Christians.
Christianity and the Roman authorities are moving toward another collision. The 2nd century. Christians are now a sizable minority in Rome, perhaps several thousand people. The faith accepts new converts all the time, and its message reaches all corners of the community.
Generally speaking, early Christianity is a religion of the poor and people who aren't part of the system. All of these social problems which any poor person would encounter in a large city were things that the Christian organizations would provide.
They do not seek conflict with the state, so there are lengthy periods when the Roman authorities see no need to harass the Christians. Yet the two sides will frequently clash over one issue. Not what the Christians believe, but what they refuse to do.
And they found in the demands of traditional state religion within the Roman Empire things that they couldn't tolerate.
If you asked a Roman, what do you believe? Do you believe in the gods? Do you believe that sacrifices work? They'd probably give you a blank stare. Had a religion of contract, which meant if they gave gifts to the gods must return in kind and answer those prayers. And they actually had a phrase for this, do ut des, which is, I give so that you might give.
Roman religion is clear. Fail to sacrifice, and you bring disaster upon the city.
You cannot play around with religion. You cannot mess around with ritual.
But it's equally clear to the Christians that sacrifice to anyone but their God is blasphemy.
The Christians no longer wanted to participate.
And this is why Rome kills Christians. Even the 3rd century martyr Cecilia, who is said to have converted 400 people in a single day, dies not for this, but because she refuses to sacrifice.
She's got to face death by the sword. The executioner brings the sword down on her neck, but he doesn't manage to deal a death blow to her. And it takes 3 long days for Cecilia to die.
Up to 1,000 Christians die under Rome's pagan emperors. But most of the history about this is written much later by Christians.
It's tempting to simply look at this as the Roman state and its religion persecuting another religion, putting it down.
But the Romans saw it differently.
The Emperor Trajan wrote a letter to one of his governors. Christians, of course, should be punished if they will not sacrifice to the state gods, but they should not, on the other hand, be hunted down.
They're simply lawbreakers. One side's revered martyrs are the other's common criminals.
They died in the same way as other criminals or others who disobeyed imperial orders would have died in the Roman world. Christian persecution is one way of looking at a problem that others might just call law enforcement and punishment.
The Colosseum, perhaps ancient Rome's greatest building, and one of the most recognizable. It's long been associated with persecution. Here is where Christians were thrown to the lions. And yet they probably only make up a tiny fraction of those killed here.
Christians suffered. Christians, although there's no specific evidence of Christians having been martyred in the Colosseum, they almost certainly were.
What's very interesting to me is that average Romans, politicians, criminals, men and women on the street, were sentenced to death in the arena. So Christians being sentenced to death in the arena is actually nothing new.
Our whole understanding of this particular period of Roman history is viewed through the lens of the Christians that create and win the propaganda war.
Ultimately, Rome's attempts to safeguard the old ways are as ineffectual as they are brutal. The word continues to spread.
What if the Romans had tried right from the beginning to entirely wipe out the Christians, just to exterminate the lot of them right in the beginning? Well, then maybe all of Roman history and world history would be different. But that is not what the Romans did. And instead, the persecutions were sporadic and ultimately led to the creation of the cult of the martyr. And as everyone knows, the cult of the martyrs is bad PR. And ultimately, it's the Christians that will flourish, and it's the Christians that will win the propaganda war.
The cycle repeats for generations. Rome attacks, creates martyrs, and the Christians grow stronger. They continue to grow and organize. Eventually, they are no longer merely an irritant, but an organization with numbers and real power. The time has come for the old pagan elite to mount a serious attempt to stop them, but it could be too late. The 3rd century AD. Christianity is still an underground movement, but it thrives while other cults die out. Though its message is mystical, its people are practical.
It had great organization. The other mystery cults did not have the things that early Christianity had right away, like bishops. They had centers of worship. Each city had its own bishop, and he administered the rest of the clergy. That's an amazing thing the other mystery cults lacked.
This is the catacomb of St. Calixtus, where the early church buries its leaders.
Really, in the 3rd century, you see all these prominent characters rising to these positions of power within the church, which is very significant because it means that Christianity is also attractive to members of the aristocracy and not just the humble and meek, not just carpenters, shepherds, fishermen, slaves, women, but also leading figures in Roman society.
The faith spread outward, across the empire from the east. And now, it spreads up, through the hierarchy of Roman society.
Upper-class people were attracted because of the ideas that Christianity put forward, philosophical ideas. Because of the social structure, they would assume leadership in the church because they were wealthy and because they were literate.
The church is poor, but the new converts offer gifts of land and money. In return, they get something more tangible than the promise of salvation. They get power.
The bishops, you can compare them to the magistrates of a city. The priests are the senators of the city, and then there are the people. So the pyramid of power that you see in secular life is copied onto the church. Figures like any of these other important bishops in this crypt really make that difference in establishing that hierarchy. The larger their followings, the more powerful they become.
Since the church demands that faith govern every aspect of a believer's life, that power is great. It becomes even more concentrated in the hands of key individuals. Over time, a single dominant figure emerges.
The Bishop of Rome claimed superiority over the bishops of other cities, and this was clearly mimicking the structure of Rome, with the emperor coming out of Rome and exercising power over other cities. The idea is really to a great degree based upon the model of Roman administration.
In 250 AD, the Roman Empire numbered around 60 million. Only 1 million are Christians. 50 years later, the population is nearly the same, but 1 in 10 Romans are now Christians, an estimated 6 million of them. The system to which they owe allegiance mirrors the Roman state. It also has the power to threaten it. The Great Persecution begins in 303 AD, Rome's last attempt to strike back. This is Piazza Navona, now a tourist attraction. Back then, a great stadium stood here.
It was built at the end of the 1st century by the Emperor Domitian for public entertainment. There were chariots that went around here, there were carriage races, there were gladiatorial fights and things like that. 200 years later, it was used for a pretty nefarious reason.
It is a place of death.
This was one of the epicenters for Christian martyrdom and persecution.
In 303 AD, the Emperor Diocletian plots to decapitate the Christian movement. Word travels across the Eastern Empire. Scriptures and places of worship are to be destroyed. All Christian gatherings are already prohibited. They lose any right to petition the courts. Many are thrown into prison. The emperor attempts to return Rome to its glory days, when the old gods were unopposed.
He wants traditional religion to survive. He wants traditional religion to flourish.
That means giving the prominent Christians a very stark choice.
What he demands is a test that they will undertake sacrifice, because otherwise he feels they're not just being disloyal to him, they're being disloyal to the idea of Rome, and therefore they're traitors.
Typically, the penalty for this kind of treason is death by burning.
Diocletian ordered Christians to be rounded up wherever they were. His persecutions were directed at members of the elite. But pretty much anybody who got in the way also risked the danger of being rounded up and brought to this very place.
Some Christians give in and sacrifice. Many are simply released by sympathetic officials. Historians estimate up to 5,000 people die. But amidst all that bloodshed, what becomes clear is that this is the last gasp of a once great faith. And it's the old religion, not Christianity, which is dying. Soon, the Roman state and the Christian establishment will fuse and become one. Traditionally, the only success that really matters in Rome is military. In an empire built on conquest, a leader makes his name by winning wars. The Christian's message completely counters the ways of Rome. Yet their takeover of the empire is cemented with a battlefield victory. In the shadow of the Colosseum, where so many Christians died, stands this arch. Like others across the empire, it's a monument built by a triumphant general, Constantine.
What's unusual about this inscription is the third line, which attributes Constantine's victory to not only his own considerable skills, but quod instinctu divinitatis, to the inspiration of a divinity. Now, despite the ambiguity, any Christian could have been fairly sure which divinity Constantine had in mind. The one, the true, the only God.
Constantine is the last man standing in a vicious civil war that determines who rules the empire. The night before his final battle, he tells his army that he's seen a vision in the sky, a sign that he should fight in the name of the God of the Christians.
What Constantine and his troops saw has remained a matter of controversy and debate. The church obviously accepts it as a miracle. Skeptics consider it a hallucination, perhaps a downright lie. But quite recently, an ingenious theory has proposed that what Constantine actually saw was a sort of solar mirage, in which a halo appeared around the sun, and what are called sun dogs, or mock suns, appearing at the sides and at the vertex, together conjuring up the vision that could be described as the High Road.
The Chi-Rho is one of the oldest Christian symbols and uses the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ. Constantine uses it to send a message.
If he went forward with the battle in the name of Christ, he would win. He did. He won. He became the emperor, the sole emperor of the empire, and Christianity had its day, finally, officially.
Now that the new faith has reached the very highest levels, change sweeps through the empire.
Whatever degree of power and influence Christians had when Constantine came to power, Constantine's conversion to Christianity had a major effect. We find that Christians are being put in positions of higher power. He also provided tax exemptions for members of the clergy. He gave enormous amounts of land to the church, and in this society, land is wealth.
So Constantine gives the church both physical and financial muscle, and the Roman genius for order and organization.
The church became efficient, it became centralized, it met on occasions, difficult questions were answered, and the force of the state was brought to bear to ensure that decisions taken were enforced universally.
Before Constantine, the church was a number of communities loosely bound together, and there was no consistent story of Jesus.
It would have circulated as any number of books in any number of forms, because Christianity was an immensely diverse faith throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and into the West.
Some of these books were discarded. The ones that Constantine's bishops deemed appropriate became part of the New Testament.
Constantine commissioned 50 copies of the New Testament to go to Christian foundations.
The Roman Empire becomes Christian. But in its discipline, its single central authority, and its ability to cross borders, Christianity has become ever more Roman.
Christianity as we know it, as an empire-wide religion, is inconceivable without the structure of Roman government and the kind of economy and trade and commerce and communication that that empire-wide Roman government provided.
This is the chapel of San Sylvester. He's Bishop of Rome, Pope under Constantine. The art on the walls depicts the moment when Constantine bestows legal authority on Sylvester's office. He might be God's representative on earth, but it's the emperor who puts power in his hand.
Constantine gives power to the church, represented here in the image, him handing the crown to the Bishop of Rome, taking him into imperial administration, giving him power, giving him secular power, not just spiritual power. Constantine does not make Christianity the religion of the state. That has to be said clearly right from the beginning. But he sets the wheels in motion for a development that goes on throughout the entire 4th century.
The fresco shows another pivotal moment. Constantine does something that would have been unthinkable for a Roman emperor just a few decades before. He's baptized. Where he leads, others follow. When Constantine builds the world's first baptistry here, it completes the reversal of the Christians' fortunes. Though Christianity was an obscure Eastern cult, the religion of immigrants and lower classes, Rome's rulers felt threatened. Rome's authorities were threatened. Yet from the earliest days, for all the cruelty, mistrust, and bloodshed, the two institutions, Roman state and Christian church, were bound together. Though Peter was killed in the persecutions under Nero and buried among the pagan tombs, the Christian message still grew. As Constantine built Peter's church on the ruins of pagan buildings, his empire was the foundation of a worldwide faith. For 1,700 years, the churches of this city have stood as a symbol of the Christian religion. Today, it claims 2 billion devotees. And it still owes a debt to pagan Rome.